And we are seeing ICE presence here in Northeast Florida this week.
Right. Agents were spotted running joint operations with FHP throughout our area.
Florida, they're trying to get their hands on your money.
Yeah, so the FBI is warning, don't fall for it. As News4Jax reporter Aaron Farrar tells us, these scammers are using threats.
The object that changed the case was not a duffel bag, a hidden room, or a stack of money. It was a resin-sealed maintenance box pulled from a drainage channel beneath Dock 7 at Gulf Meridian Logistics, 23 minutes east of downtown Houston. At 11:43 p.m., under a line of failing warehouse lights and the smell of diesel, bleach, and standing rainwater, an FBI evidence technician cut the casing open with a utility saw. Inside were 3 items: a heat-warped satellite phone, a micro SD card wrapped in foil, and a strip of waterproof paper marked with 15 route codes, 5 federal inspection windows, and 2 words written in block letters: "Hold clean." That discovery changed everything. The warrant team had entered Gulf Meridian looking for bulk cash tied to a mid-level narcotics seizure. What they found instead was a document trail suggesting the network had not merely learned freight patterns, it had learned official rhythms, inspection surges, port slowdowns, weigh station timing, bonded yard transfer hours. Somebody inside the legitimate system had been feeding a cartel logistics chain the one thing narcotics organizations pay most dearly for: predictability. The warehouse itself still looked ordinary: pallets of industrial film, wrapped produce cartons, idle forklifts, dispatch boards. But inside the drainage box was a map of concealed movement extending from Houston through Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and New Jersey. Not one run, a system. What looked like storage was actually command and control. By the time the micro SD card was imaged before dawn, to federal supervisors were no longer treating the Houston warrant as a local narcotics action. The matter was escalated to a multi-agency infrastructure task force. If the data inside that box was authentic, investigators were looking at a $4.8 billion enterprise built inside ordinary freight. To understand how they got there, you have to go back to a traffic stop that should have ended in a citation. The trigger came 8 months earlier on Interstate 10 west of Beaumont. A Texas Department of Public Safety trooper stopped a refrigerated truck for a broken side marker and an erratic lane correction during a rainburst. The trailer belonged to Pine Harbor Produce Carriers, a company with valid insurance, current tags, and clean electronic logs. The driver, 38-year-old Martin Valez, I produced a manifest showing citrus bound for a grocery distributor outside Lafayette, Louisiana. The paperwork was precise. The route was routine. The cargo temperature read correctly. One detail was not. The trailer seal on the manifest did not match the seal on the door by 1 digit. That alone might have been clerical. Then the trooper noticed the load count in the digital bill of lading had been revised twice in under 90 minutes. A secondary inspection followed. Behind pallet rows and legitimate produce, officers recovered 94 kilograms of fentanyl, 211 kilograms of cocaine, and $640,000 in banded cash. The driver had no meaningful explanation. More important, he had no apparent knowledge of the full shipment. DEA Houston treated it as a major seizure. ICE Homeland Security Investigations pulled customs and brokerage records. Then FBI analysts began reviewing carrier registrations tied to Pine Harbor, Gulf Meridian Logistics, and 2 related vendors, South Channel Brokerage and Meridian Inland Leasing. Then the anomalies began to cluster. A bonded warehouse in Pasadena reported inventory movement without matching outbound receipts. A port access credential linked to a freight contractor was used after midnight on 3 separate weekends. A weigh station software contractor in Harris County signed into a routing dashboard from a private IP address during 2 known narcotics movement windows. Each event looked minor in isolation. Together, they suggested that the freight lane was being protected by knowledge no smuggling crew should have had. That moved the case from seizure review to network inquiry. Keep the seal discrepancy in mind. And it was the first small failure in a much larger machine, and once investigators started tracing it, the machine did not lead back to one warehouse. It led into the infrastructure itself. Houston was not the destination, it was the switch point. By the third month of analysis, task force investigators had mapped a corridor system running from the South Texas border into the Gulf Freight Belt, then outward through 5 states. The network moved narcotics north and east through legitimate commercial flows, while cash, accounts, and substitute inventory moved back through the same architecture. The result was not a smuggling ring in the old sense. It was a regional supply chain. Federal analysts identified 17 warehouses used as relay nodes, cash holds, or temporary repackaging sites. 15 freight and cash routes were linked to the system. 11 compartmented cells handled downstream receipt, local storage, and secondary transport. Houston anchored the structure because its freight density created camouflage. Produce carriers, plastics distributors, bonded yards, port drayage, packaging vendors, and industrial cold storage, all operating in overlapping schedules. Then the corruption layer surfaced. An internal audit showed that 2 inspection alerts on Gulf Meridian-linked cargo had been downgraded without clear justification. A port access coordinator approved after-hours entry for contractors who were not assigned to the listed docks. A private compliance attorney filed repetitive amendments that kept several freight firms in good standing despite glaring documentation anomalies. None of those acts proved conspiracy on their own, but each one reduced friction. Each one widened a safe lane. The drainage box records confirmed what investigators had been reluctant to say aloud. The network was tracking law enforcement tempo. The route codes on the waterproof strip aligned with custom surge periods, highway interdiction windows, and staffing gaps at certain commercial transfer sites. The satellite phone contained short inbound signals referencing green belts, cold hours, and clean boards, terms analysts concluded were not street slang, but control language for protected movement. The micro SD card held dispatch exports, warehouse access logs, and draft spreadsheets connecting freight companies to shell entities with no legitimate volume. Treasury followed those entities into equipment leases, insurance claims, real estate notes, and account clusters valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. And by then, the case had been reframed. This was no longer a narcotics corridor attached to business fronts. It was a business-facing logistics platform serving narcotics flow. Watch the pattern now. Freight first, cash second, paper everywhere. That sequence explained how the enterprise grew quietly enough to reach $4.8 billion in combined narcotics value, seized currency, frozen assets, and controlled infrastructure before the system finally broke. The mechanism was disciplined because it was commercial. Loads did not move as dramatic one-off convoys. They moved as substitutions, split consignments, delayed transfers, and short-haul handoffs inside legitimate freight volume. A produce carrier might deliver exactly what its manifest showed. A second load tied to the same broker would carry the risk. A warehouse would receive lawful packaging materials in daylight and an illicit transfer after inventory close. No single driver, dock worker, or dispatcher needed the whole picture. That compartmentation protected the network. Pine Harbor produce carriers handled cover traffic. Gulf Meridian Logistics provided storage density and route flexibility. South Channel Brokerage solved billing and last-minute rerouting. Meridian Inland Leasing held trailers, forklifts, and industrial property under layers of proxy ownership. Above them sat legal and accounting intermediaries who turned movement into paperwork and paperwork into distance from criminal liability. The money system followed the same principle. Proceeds were not stored in one vault. They were diluted across freight invoices, overbilled service contracts, commercial equipment notes, casualty claims, and property acquisitions tied to transport infrastructure. Bulk cash existed, but it was only one layer. The more durable concealment came through ordinary business forms that made extraordinary revenue look merely complicated. Investigators also learned that the network did not need full institutional capture. It only needed selective compromise. one customs-facing contractor who adjusted cargo descriptions, one warehouse compliance manager who softened internal questions, one technology vendor with visibility into route dashboards, one port coordinator willing to normalize after-hours access. That was enough to reduce risk across multiple corridors. Not immunity, just margin. And in freight, margin is everything. And that is why the task force treated the case as infrastructure infiltration rather than a conventional cartel bust. The organization had embedded itself in timing systems, access systems, lease systems, and payment systems already trusted by commerce. It did not overpower the freight network. It rented space inside it, learned its habits, and concealed narcotics flow beneath legitimate movement until the operating pattern became almost invisible. What looked like logistics support was actually protected transit. The public record eventually focused on 5 names. Victor Salazar, 46, served as operations director for Gulf Meridian Logistics. Employees described him as methodical, unemotional, and exact about dock assignments. According to the indictment, Salazar did not function as a street trafficker. He functioned as a scheduler, and that made him more dangerous. He controlled where freight paused, where trailers sat, and which inbound anomalies were treated as routine. Dana Kessler, 51, was a trade compliance attorney with offices in Houston and New Orleans. Prosecutors alleged that she maintained the legal posture of multiple shell companies and filed corrective documentation designed to keep suspect firms commercially credible. Her role was not movement, it was camouflage. Ruben Ochoa managed 2 relay warehouses on the east side of Houston and 1 overflow site in Baton Rouge. He supervised labor crews, after-hours access, and short-stay inventory that never appeared in standard retention logs. Leonard Price, a contract systems technician for a regional way station vendor, had administrative visibility into routing and inspection dashboards. Melissa Crane, a private bonded yard auditor, allegedly flagged internal reviews before certain freight windows closed. Those were the infrastructure-facing figures. Below them sat 11 operational cells across Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and New Jersey. Above them, according to federal filings, were cartel-linked suppliers and finance handlers who remained outside immediate U.S. custody. That hierarchy mattered. The American side did not manufacture the threat. It enabled its movement, its storage, and its survivability. Hold on to that distinction. The eventual takedown was not aimed at one warehouse boss or one dirty load. It was aimed at the nodes that made the whole platform function. The strike phase was authorized under the name Operation Ironspan. Because the network lived inside logistics timing, the takedown had to do the same. The federal planners avoided dawn. They chose a staggered Sunday night window when port traffic was thinner, distribution offices were understaffed, and weekend freight substitutions could not easily be absorbed. At 8:06 p.m. Central, synchronized warrants were executed across Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and New Jersey. The first wave hit the Houston core. FBI teams moved on Gulf Meridian Logistics, South Channel Brokerage, and 3 warehouse sites in Pasadena, Baytown, and East Houston. ICEHS. Agents executed customs and document warrants tied to bonded yard records and cross-border brokerage files. DEA strike groups entered stash locations identified through the drainage box data and prior surveillance. Treasury simultaneously transmitted freeze orders to banks, escrow firms, vehicle lenders, and title agents linked to the shell network. The second wave hit the relay states. Louisiana State Police and federal agents secured 2 Baton Rouge storage sites and a logistics office outside Lafayette. Mississippi targets included a short-term freight yard and a repackaging warehouse near Gulfport. In Georgia, task force teams entered an industrial property south of Atlanta, used by one of the downstream cells for receiving and secondary dispatch. In New Jersey, agents moved on a Newark area cross-dock facility tied to eastbound distribution. Then the scale became visible. By 1:30 a.m., 17 warehouses and yards had been searched or secured. 15 routes were disrupted through arrests, seizure warrants, or access denials. 11 operational cells were functionally neutralized. Bulk seizures included 4,260 kilograms of fentanyl, 2,980 kilograms of cocaine, 1,740 kilograms of methamphetamine, 186 firearms, and compressed cash stored at multiple nodes. By the end of the rolling operation, 118 arrests had been made or scheduled for immediate pickup. The asset picture widened even further. Treasury froze $610 million in accounts, properties, vehicles, and corporate paper tied to the enterprise. When combined with confiscated narcotics, seized currency, and controlled freight assets, the government valued the disrupted network at approximately $4.8 billion. But the most important evidence was not the product. At a records annex near the Houston Ship Channel, agents recovered internal dispatch boards, route calendars, signed access memos, and communications showing that several movement windows had been coordinated around known enforcement slow periods. And that was the corruption proof. Not broad mythology, not rumor. Administrative actions serving criminal timing. By sunrise, the public would see warehouses, handcuffs, and pallets of evidence. Investigators saw something else. An infrastructure breach that had finally been forced into the open. The evidence review lasted for weeks because the case was not just large, it was layered. Agents cataloged narcotics, firearms, bulk currency, encrypted devices, warehouse ledgers, freight manifests, shell company records, access credentials, and account chains. Seized material included 4,260 kilograms of fentanyl, 2,980 kilograms of cocaine, 1,740 kilograms of methamphetamine, 186 firearms, and more than $92 million in immediate bulk cash. Treasury's parallel review froze $610 million in bank accounts, transport assets, real estate, and corporate instruments tied to the network. Digital evidence proved equally damaging. Forensic teams recovered route exports matching the 15 disrupted corridors, internal status boards tying 11 cells to Houston-based dispatch logic, and message fragments that aligned protected movement with inspection gaps and after-hours facility access. The drainage box micro SD card turned out to be a condensed backup of a much larger control archive. That archive connected freight paperwork to operational timing with unusual clarity. Federal prosecutors also focused on contamination of legitimate systems. Commercial yards had been used to stage criminal transfers. Bonded access had been exploited to reduce scrutiny. Contract visibility into route and inspection data had been weaponized. Unordinary business documents had been turned into concealment layers. That finding broadened the consequences of the case beyond narcotics, counts alone. The question was no longer whether there had been a breach. The question was how much ordinary infrastructure had already been taught to carry extraordinary risk. The casualties of a logistics case rarely appear at the loading dock. In Harris County, 24-year-old Ava Moreno died after ingesting counterfeit pills, later linked to one of the Texas cell distributions. In Mobile, Alabama, truck mechanic Darren Pike was found dead from fentanyl exposure tied to product moving east through one of the Gulf corridors. Their names never appeared in route spreadsheets or warehouse ledgers, but they were the final destination of every protected lane. There was institutional damage as well. Honest port workers discovered that access systems they trusted had been quietly exploited. Freight firms operating near the compromised hubs faced suspicion they did not earn. Local narcotics units in multiple states learned that street-level seizures had been symptoms, not sources. Communities that already lived beside warehouse belts, truck yards, and industrial traffic had also been living beside concealed transit nodes without knowing it. That is the national cost of infrastructure-based trafficking. It does not simply move poison. It converts ordinary commercial systems into carriers of risk. It bends compliance, erodes trust, and makes every legitimate transaction in the same corridor harder to defend. The dead mark the human endpoint. The deeper injury is systemic. A freight network taught to serve two economies at once, one lawful and one lethal. The indictments arrived in sequence: narcotics conspiracy, money laundering, continuing criminal enterprise, firearms offenses, obstruction, conspiracy to defraud the United States. Asset forfeiture actions followed the criminal counts with equal force because prosecutors understood the enterprise correctly. This was not just a smuggling line, it was a revenue-generating infrastructure platform. Victor Salazar pleaded not guilty, then reversed course after internal dispatch files and warehouse access logs were tied directly to his scheduling authority. Dana Kessler fought the case longer, but communications linking legal correction filings to suspect freight entities narrowed her defense options. Ruben Ochoa, Leonard Price, and Melissa Crane each faced separate exposure tied to the institutional layer that had reduced friction for movement. Lower-tier cell coordinators cooperated first. Drivers and yard supervisors followed when the financial record became impossible to deny. By the time the first major plea hearings concluded, the government had documented a 5-state enterprise built around 17 raided warehouses, 15 disrupted routes, 11 operational cells, 118 arrests, $610 million frozen in traceable assets, and a combined confiscation value estimated at $4.8 billion. That sounds like closure. It is not. Two foreign finance handlers tied to upstream suppliers were not arrested. One Gulf Corridor route architect disappeared before sealed warrants were opened. Within months, federal monitors identified smaller freight anomalies in secondary markets that resembled the early stages of the same model: thin volume companies, layered leaseholds, unexplained insurance events, after-hours yard access, and route timing that made too much sense. Remember what this operation actually proved. The next major trafficking threat may not arrive in a shootout, a border chase, or a single spectacular seizure. It may arrive in invoices, dispatch software, contractor credentials, yard leases, and freight substitutions so ordinary that nobody notices until the casualty counts begin to align. That is why this case belongs in the category of national security, not just narcotics enforcement. A hostile criminal system learned how to inhabit domestic infrastructure without visibly breaking it. An Operation Iron Span fractured that system. It did not eliminate the blueprint. The warehouses can be emptied. The accounts can be frozen. The route map can be seized. But the hidden lesson remains available to anyone studying American commerce from the outside. If you can predict the system, you can try to weaponize it. And if enforcement arrives late, ordinary infrastructure becomes the battlefield before the public even understands a war is underway.